Well, we're going to have a fun discussion today, and that's because we have another independent researcher joining us who is excited about getting people's uh, metabolic health in order, getting their thyroid high, and particularly he has a fascination with understanding how to have an energetic brain. He's the poster Bioenergetic Brain on X. Peter joins me now. How you doing, Peter?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for coming on the show. I've enjoyed some of your posts, and that's why I reached out to have you on. I like to showcase folks who are, working online to kind of help make sense for people in real time, not presenting themselves as gurus, but rather, perpetual students of health and nutrition and biology. I guess that's what you would consider yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly. I've always been curious about how things work. So, especially Ray Peat's like background being a physiologist, he was sort of the same, just wanting to understand how things work. He didn't come from a like medical background.
Yeah. So what was your entry point into understanding Ray Peat's philosophy? You go back some time. I think you said 2011. Is that right?
Yeah, he had this obscure website, raypeat.com, and I'd be like trying to solve my own health problems or like family members just trying to understand how things work. And every now and then, back then it was mainly forums, like people would link, oh, have a look at Ray Peat's information. You'd end up on his website, he'd have these really dense articles about hormones or CO2 or sugar's not that bad for you. And I'd always find it interesting. I'd read it and then it take a while to digest. And I'm like, oh, I don't know if this guy's got this stuff figured out or not, or if he's just some, you know, being on the internet, you can read like anything and there's no one to like tell you who's right and wrong. You got to make that, decision for yourself. So it took a while, but eventually I started sort of fitting the puzzle pieces together, and it felt like it was making a lot of coherent sense to me. And yeah, I just kept sort of trying to understand more and reading more.
Yeah. Now, did you have like a health issue in particular you were trying to solve, or you just wanted to understand how human biology works?
Sort of both. So um, yeah, my issues were um, just trying to have consistent energy. I was studying at the time, and I noticed like sometimes I just couldn't think. I was like, why can't I think? And for whatever reason, my bias was to think it was some obscure, hard to find problem, like some like gene or something that was wrong with me, or what was it? Uh, but then, it was really interesting to. It took years basically, but to realize, oh, I just my blood sugar's low. Which is what people complain about. Like a lot of his like advice is like really simple. It doesn't seem very intelligent. Like, oh, you just need to eat some food or have a drink, have a Coke. Like, doesn't seem that insightful. But the more I did that, and the more I realized, oh, if I'm overthinking, my blood sugar is low. I just need to eat something. Um, it's really fascinating to think like, all these traditional diets and traditional ways of eating, we've sort of so medicalized that we always think there's some really weird problem when a lot of time it's very simple.
So when you have and I you and I talked a little bit about some of the health effects of higher altitude, and I know you've done taken steps to get to a higher altitude in recent times. What have you noticed? You're at, you said, pretty high, 2,000 meters. Is that right?
Yeah, 2,000 meters, just over 7,000 feet. Um, I've definitely noticed being out of breath more. I don't know how much the like um, time to adapt it usually would take for this, like I was basically at sea level before, so what's that, like 0 to 100 feet, and then suddenly to 7,000 feet. Um, I definitely noticed like being out of breath more, but generally my energy seems more stable. I sleep a little bit better. Um, and I think what I noticed on flights, I noticed a bit more. So on flights, I noticed my hands flush a bit more. Like there's more blood in my hands and feet, like my extremities, and that most of the time for me translates also to feeling more like blood flow in my like front part of my brain, my like human part of my brain, and I just feel like I think better. So I've noticed it on flights, and I feel like I noticed that a bit more being at this altitude as well.
Mhm.
And interestingly, the first time I took thyroid, I also felt a very similar thing. It never happened after that first initial time, but I felt this nice, like calm, extra blood flow, especially my hands and feet. And that's one of the common symptoms of low thyroid. People have cold hands and feet, which is just means that there's not enough blood flowing in that area.
What do you what kind of thyroid did you say you took? Did you have
Yeah, I've tried a few different. I tried Georgie's initially, or maybe it was another one as well. Like no, I had the desiccated one, but yeah, the I was not happy with the standardization of like trying to like dose it. So I found a more like pharmaceutical grade. I think it's made in Turkey. So it's normal tablets because I was in Europe at the time and that was the easiest one to source. So it's very easy to, dose it correctly because you're supposed to like, gradually increase it over a month or so and taper off if you're changing a dose. So it was the easiest to do with that one.
why do you think that the thyroid supplementation and high altitude has a similar experience for people, perhaps physiologically?
Yeah, so my understanding of what thyroid's doing is it's quite holistic, but you can also point to some of the mechanical sort of aspects and like at the deep level, it actually binds to DNA. The DNA expresses the mitochondrial enzymes that actually convert your, you know, food source of energy, fat or carbs, into the end product, which is water and ATP. But in the process, it also produces CO2, and that is the same sort of effect that you get at high altitude. So at sea level, you have in gas you have partial pressures. So at sea level, there's higher percentage of oxygen compared to carbon dioxide. But the higher you go up, the more percent of the air is carbon dioxide. So I think you've covered in your show a few times that it's been noticed there's quite a strong effect of altitude on various health conditions and even just how long-lived populations are.
Yeah, I've always wondered. I live in Florida, and I have I have some Northern European genes and probably some mountain
Mm,
higher altitude living. And
mm,
I've always commented, I said, something I've lived in Florida my whole life, and I thought, I don't feel like I fit into this environment,
mm.
Physiologically, I was like, I just something, and now, you know, as I've come to understand it, it could be very much true that, being designed for higher altitude living, uh, physiologically, I know it's not all genetics, but, there could be something there to a mismatch for my
Yeah,
design, because I wasn't meant to be in a hot, muggy bathhouse environment 24/7.
yeah, that's definitely true. Coming from Australia, like, that's very visible with all the skin cancer. There's all these people with not enough, tanned skin, and then we've got like super strong UV light in Australia and all the surf and beach culture. It's,
And they're probably
I
just
think one of the
tearing,
highest in the
yeah,
world with like skin cancers.
and they're probably tearing into that seed oil over there, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt that's contributing a lot. That'd actually be interesting to see if there's a
Now, were you
carbon
in
going back 100 years.
were you in Australia when they were going after all those lockdowns and making you sign in on the app to let people know you were 5 feet away from your house and stuff?
Yeah, yep,
You lived
that's
through
right.
that?
Yeah,
Good. I had a lot of listeners from Australia. They still probably, I still hear from some of them, but a lot of vocal Australian listeners that would call into the radio show or email me to update me on how horrific those times were. Were you traumatized by that experience, or you were pretty chill about it?
no, I was quite paranoid. I couldn't believe what I was seeing and hearing and how quickly it all happened. Because initially it was like, 2 weeks. And then everyone thought, oh, we get 2 weeks off work. This is great. And then very quickly it turned into, oh, might need to be a bit longer than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That's when I started getting really paranoid. I couldn't believe the types of things that they were proposing to introduce.
What do you think was going on? That was just activating the mass serotonin soaked mentality of most people that were just activated into lemming mode in an aggressive way, or what?
Yeah, well, that was maybe one of the most surprising thing. I thought there'd be a lot more like pushback or people complaining, saying, hang on, we can't just not work. Like, and I definitely saw this groupthink type attitude where everyone was just like, oh, I guess we just got to do this now. And there's lots of dissenting voices, but it didn't seem to change what was happening. And Australia seemed worse than so many other places. Like it's kind of convenient for the government that you can't cross the land border when you're in Australia. It's not easy to leave, and they can basically you know control how things operate much more than say Europe, where like there's so many borders, and you can just, if you don't like how things are run in one country, you just move over, walk over to the next country. Um, yeah.
Gilbert Ling is someone that you've talked about, and Ray Peat talked about him a lot. Tell us who he was and tell us about that animation that you showed on X recently. We can link to it in the description for people.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so he's a really interesting researcher that was very prolific in how much stuff he like discovered and tried to communicate and wrote books about. And he recently passed away a few years ago, I think at 99. So even then, I think he was still publishing work. But yeah, he was a Chinese, uh, not biologist, he was a physiologist, and he got a grant to come to the US to study when he was very young. Um, and he recounts how he was very fortunate for that to happen. But early on, he was very like successful with a few things. Like he invented um, an electrode you could read off the electric potential in a cell or biological medium, which he hadn't been able to do before. So he figured out a way to do these electrical readings. Um, so he got sort of well known for that. And then what he's most well known for is sort of continuing the line of research that was looking at the cell as not needing a membrane. So early
Mhm.
on, when they first saw cells under a microscope, people had to come up with an explanation for what keeps it contained in like a sphere or that shape. And there was basically two competing ideas. One was that there was some kind of fatty, um, bag or hardened surface on the outside that kept the contents inside, whereas the other view was the actual makeup of the entire cell was what created the surface. It was more like a protein ball that it didn't need to have any kind of bag to contain it. The actual contents of the cell was what kept its shape. And so he sort of took that line and kept researching and made a lot of discoveries in that area, showing that like he would do experiments with frog muscles and show like how the ions would um, stay behind or not, depending on the different conditions you do an experiment in. And sort of most famously, what he was publishing got into the hands of some researchers, and it led to the discovery of MRI imaging, where because his model talked about the cell water varying, so because in the cell, the way he saw the water was that it was people use modern language like structured water, but yeah, it literally means like on a protein surface, you can have like the immediate water touching the surface um, because there's an electric charge on the surface and the water has its own sort of partial charge. It'll attach and orient a certain way. Like if it's positive, the hydrogen side of water will attach, whereas if it's negative, the oxygen side will attach. And that causes this kind of ordered layering of the water that builds out into he would talk about like 6 or plus layers of water structuring. And because of that, the sort of array of the water molecules, they're sort of fixed in space more so than if they were just in regular water where they're free to rotate, free to move around. And this researcher, Raymond Damadian, was reading his work and sort of had this insight that, hang on, if the water's spinning freely in like regular water and the water in the cell is sort of a bit more restrained, we should be able to detect that with this equipment he was aware of. So he actually went ahead and started developing that, thinking that he should be able to detect cancerous cells versus other cells, because you should be able to build an image. And yeah, he turned out to be correct with that. And so he did go on to invent the MRI that, like, you know, now you go to get some body part scanned and you can see not just bone, but like different tissues very clearly. And that's because the relaxation time of the water, the giant magnets they use to pick up the change in the movement of the water, in cancer cells, they're actually way more free than a regular cell. A regular cell, the water's more like a ice, like solid formation, like a gel. And so it's very easy to see the difference when the tissue is not, you know, structured like that. So yeah, it's super fascinating, I think. And there's so many aspects to that that is missing because Gilbert Ling's view basically was not the one that got chosen to be the mainstream view, which happens often in science. Like there's this account on Twitter, Controversies in Science, and he sort of documents all the different fields of science, how there were usually like multiple streams of like looking at things or multiple schools of thought, but for whatever reason, one would get picked that would go into the textbooks. You wouldn't hear about the other, you know, directions of research was going, and you would just think, oh, this is sort of settled. This is how we understand things. But there was usually always this whole other group of scientists who were saying, hang on, you know, that doesn't make sense. We've got this other view. It makes more sense. So Gilbert Ling's view of the cell never became popular. There was still always research that went on with like in Europe in some places and in Soviet Russia. I think they were more in line with his view of the cell, which is where I think Ray might have come across it. But yeah, to this day, like you'll read a textbook and it'll show like a cell with a biolipid membrane. But I try to find like the current like best imaging we have on like that biolipid membrane, and it just doesn't exist. Like it's difficult because it's so small, and like normally the way you do imaging for that kind of tiny small scale is you have to kill the thing. So like if you're doing electron microscopy, you have to like spray whatever you're imaging with metal, and then you're actually taking an image of like the metal. So there's all these like indirect methods. So it's just, yeah, fascinating that we have all these like textbooks, images, cartoons of things that we don't even know how correct they are, that, you know, they're just the best guess or the whatever became the most popular idea.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the theme of this program. What we do, you know, through the years is we explore the Galileos of our time, you know, and the folks, the Nikola Teslas, the Galileos, and we amplify their voice. And you know, I I think I'm gonna set it up in a way that maybe you can guide us with some your perspectives, which is, you know, we think that, you know, the problem of what we call lunchroom drama, which is politics and all of this, is a waste of time, and we have to find win-win solutions. In order to find win-win solutions, you have to have an abundant state of mind, and in order to have an abundant state of mind, you typically have to take sovereignty over your body and your mind, and then it kind of has a feedback loop. You know, I think it's no coincidence that we had such an explosion of great technological innovation from, let's say, 18 you know, the 18 late 1860s to the 19 you know, 30s or 40s, when we didn't have as much war and we didn't have as much PUFA and seed oil consumption, you have an explosion in technology development. Alexander Graham Bell, Nikola Tesla, all these great folks doing wonderful things, steamships, telegraph, everything just boom, 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 high creativity, high thyroid, high vibration, happy dopamine, let's go. Things were not perfect. Obviously, that's what, you can always look at flaws, but um, I think you add in the PUFA, you add in war, and then you get to this kind of lemming state that we've been kind of trapped into in various ways progressively ever since. And, we need to get out of that. We need to get back to the kind of the high energy state of wonder and intuition, but we're not allowed to do that. Everybody's stuck on, lamenting how they're a victim. This group is a victim because of their race, their gender. This group is a victim because of their race and their gender and their ideology. And all people do is just fight over, how to rearrange the the chairs on Titanic as it's sinking. This is a very horrible scarcity driven framework of reality. And that's why everybody's clawing at each other and angry and cynical, and there's no hope, and you can't talk with passion. Even podcasts, the way they're supposed to talk, you're not supposed to be passionate. You're not supposed to say, "Hey, let's have a great time." Oh, that's a cringe thing to be like happy and passionate and charismatic. And people are just lost in a sea of a kind of stupor of learned helplessness, as Ray Peat would put it.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely see the same kind of trend and difference with like, yeah, the 19th century or 18th century. Um, and yeah, I think a lot of that too comes down to agency, which is what Ray Peat spends a lot of time talking about. And I think it's because government's become so dominant in people's lives that like it's the only solution to, social problems or any kind of problem. It's like, oh well, we have to vote the right person in.
Yeah.
Whereas back then, I don't think, well, I know the government was not as big. Like I remember a stat that in the UK now, the government employs like 50% of the population,
What?
whereas 100 years ago it was like less than 5% or something. Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
57% of the population in the UK?
50,
Oh, 15?
50,
Oh,
50. Yeah,
50. Dear God, that's still too high. Goodness. And what are
yeah.
they doing with it? Nothing.
I don't know. Well, this is a problem when things are too centralized. Like, this is what happened during the, 2020, 2021.
Yeah.
You couldn't see a doctor and have them give you their opinion or
Yeah.
their advice. It was, oh, I have to follow this protocol
Yeah.
because that's just what's been handed me to do. Otherwise, I lose my job. Or like, it's just too much control,
Yeah.
which means people don't have agency, but if you, I grew up like that, right? Where and you just grew up in this world and you just feel like the only way to change things is to vote the right person in. But very early on, I noticed it didn't matter. Like we got voting, like things just kept moving in a certain direction regardless.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one thing that appeals that is that you can't really separate a lack of agency with health. And
Mm.
if you feel trapped or you feel like you know, nothing you do in life affects your life, like, um, which is unfortunately that's what happens if you're poor, if you don't have money to like buy something you need or, buy basic things or live in a decent place. You just feel trapped or you don't have what you need. And I feel like 100 or 200 years ago, like even if people didn't have as much, they had more freedom that, or they didn't have as much control or someone tell them this is the way you must do things, or even just like the economy, like business, there weren't as many regulations, there weren't as many people telling you couldn't sell something or couldn't
Mm.
bake food a certain way. You had to add
Yeah.
a certain ingredient, or
Yeah.
like, it's just so much control now. And I think it's
Yeah.
really lacking and affecting people's health. And you know, in scarcity, I think people just fight over the crumbs and like
Yeah.
argue, and like in abundance, like people relax and they think about their future and think, oh, how can we've got all
A-
these extra resources? What should we
a-
build?
And then you know how bad the learned helplessness is baked into the mindset when I talk about things that we can do, like, okay, let's have energy too cheap to meter. Let's have 24/7 energy panels that don't
Mm,
require sunlight. Let's have low temperature nuclear energy. Let's have anti-gravity technology instead of tires in our traditional way of transportation and flights and so forth. Let's have elemental transmutation, taking trash and turning it into rare earth elements using magnetic fields. Let's have cures for big diseases that are right under our noses that don't require a massive insurance expense or massive, government subsidy to afford. Let's have these win-win solutions. And then you know what people do? They typically say, well, humans are such that if we have all that, we'll still be fighting. And it's a way of getting them to stay in their own little slavery. They tell that to
mm,
themselves. Well, we'll still have problems. I don't want to even try. That's such a defeatist mindset. It's like, don't even want to try anything to get out of your enslavement and your tyranny, because you're already telling yourself, well, once I get to that stage, it won't still be perfect. There'll be other problems. I mean, how does that even
mm.
make sense as a species to continue?
Yeah, some kind of Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah, it is. And then you got the new right, which is, they're always pining for a little Caesar to come and save them from the bureaucracy. And
Hmm.
you think to
Hmm.
yourself, my God, I mean, this is where we're at. This is the tip of the spear of men's political ideas right now, is just begging for a little Napoleon to come save him or something. And it doesn't make any sense because, again, like you said, none of that is going to solve the whole cultural attitude that is baked into everything that I don't see conservatives or right wingers even doing anything to touch. They haven't cut one agency on any federal or state or local level in 100 years. They've done nothing. They can't
Hmm.
stop you from being arrested for selling lasagna from your kitchen.
Hmm.
They can't stop you from that. They're a bunch of coward jerks. They can't do anything. They can't even stop you from being arrested for selling milk from a cow. What have they done? They're impotent fools. And they're just begging for the next little right wing FDR or something to come and save them, because they're so much better than libertarians. I don't care. I don't give a damn about libertarian versus right wing. This is garbage. The whole situation is just garbage, but it doesn't have to stay that way. I think these things are much easier to do than we realize, even though they can be complicated. Just a little bit of organization and talent pooling together can create things like energy that's abundant. And then of course there's always the thing they'll say, well, oh no, we've already had endless energy, but everyone who invents it gets taken out. And it's like, well, that's another myth of learned helplessness that allows you to stay in your situation, right? As you say, well, if I do
Hmm.
anything great, we'll be taken out or compromised. And it's like, we've got enough technology now. We have enough podcasts and live streamers and decentralized media distribution that we can protect the new Teslas of our time, so to speak, that are doing amazing things with being able to
Hmm.
capture their inventions on live stream videos. And oh, you take out this one, we've got 100 others that are distributing it on 100 other platforms and 100 other podcasts.
Right.
So it's like the
Yeah.
the kind of support that's situated right now is better than ever for disruptive innovators to change the paradigm shift between us and these old-fashioned tyrants.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I remember realizing how powerful the internet could be and thinking, oh, surely they're gonna like start locking it down at some point. But for so long, like I didn't see any efforts, and it was only during the last few years where I actually saw like these somewhat, intentional efforts to like censor or block information. But mainly that was only done through these giant platforms that have become the internet. Like there's this meme going around that the internet is now just Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. you know, whereas in the past it used to be just these way more diverse and random websites and these like remember the website rings? Like you would hop onto one website and then have like a club of websites in the same sort of theme. And then, search engines came along, but then it just became Google was the only search engine really. Um, So even with the efforts of censoring, it's only been in these giant platforms. As a whole, the internet, you can still um, find an alternative most of the time. And it was so good to see in the last few years that, with all the censorship, all these other, um, you know, platforms popped up.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back to the Gilbert Ling story. That was interesting. So what exactly is being what can you explain again what is the cause of the separation between the gel-like cell material that does not have a cell membrane versus material around it? That's a
Yeah,
charge
well,
differential.
I'm still working on that as well, and that's part of the reason I'm creating these animations because it'll having to construct them will force me to really get into the details and also figure out what Ling actually figured out, whereas what was speculation or what's still to be discovered. But as far as he put it, the end product of metabolism through the mitochondria is ATP, and he so if you read a modern textbook, it'll say ATP has this high energy phosphate bond. It's got these three phosphates on it. And when it loses one phosphate, somehow the energy from that like drives motors and makes muscles contract and does all these things. But it's not quite clear how it does that. I remember when I went through a biochemistry uh, course, the lecturer was saying he was sort of making fun of it, saying we don't actually know what's going on here, but somehow the energy, like it's clear that ATP is what like all your food is like going into producing, but it's not quite clear how that's connected to how you move your muscles. And so Gilbert Ling has a very different view on what's happening with the ATP. So he still sees ATP being like the final product of metabolism, but he sees that and this is explored with experiments as well, but the ATP binds to protein, and usually proteins seen as like these globular folded up proteins that are like balls. But he sees that there's a whole other class of proteins that are in a natural state. They're basically completely unfolded, so their backbone is exposed, and so things can bind to them. So he sees ATP binding to these certain sites along the protein um, backbone that shifts the electron cloud, so to speak, in such a way to cause then potassium to bind along the backbone. And that happening causes the water to then bind to the protein and the ions that are attaching to the protein a certain way, causing it to layer the water to a gel-like state. So like it's similar to when you make jelly, right? You don't need to put much gelatin in the water for that liquid water to turn into this solid. Well, it's not quite a solid, right? It's not brittle, but it's a sort of in between phase of solid and liquid. It's a gel, and that's basically what our tissue is, right? It's not quite solid. It's not liquid. It's something in between, and so the ATP binding to the protein in cells causes the water to structure, and it's actually the collapse of that water structure that causes the activity of where the cell is. So I found a good video on YouTube recently that actually demonstrates that. It's by a researcher who's following sort of Gilbert Ling's direction. And yeah, he shows very clearly that the buildup of the water and its collapse is what causes the action of the particular cell. So in a muscle cell, that would be the fibers of the muscle pulling either towards or against each other in contraction or the opposite. And then so it's the actual resting state that the cell returns to after the activity of the cell. So in a muscle, for example, after you contract and then release, the ATP is actually building up that structure after the contraction, getting ready for another contraction. So it's kind of like this almost backwards sort of view where like it's not it's sort of like the battery that's recharging the cell for the next action rather than it's like an engine that's actively causing the motion, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Say it again, just for our audience and me, just so it's not like a. Um, you said it's more like a battery that's recharging for the next action. That's the cell's job.
Yeah, so if you imagine the water inside the cell is being structured by the ATP. So the sugar or fat being processed by the mitochondria is making ATP. The ATP is interacting with the proteins to build up this structured water. And then once it's, at a certain level, that cell is ready to do whatever action it does. So in a muscle cell, it'll be contraction. In a neuron, that'll be whatever the neurons do when they activate. Um, whatever the cell needs to do. His model is that the energy is stored in this layering of the water. So that's what I'm hoping to explore further with these animations. So I can be satisfied that it makes sense, and I can because he's got his book's full of lots of like words. He's got a lot of equations.
Yeah.
He's got lots of tables, graphs, and then
Hey,
occasionally he'll have some diagrams.
well,
And I'm
give
hoping
some.
to translate that into a lot more like, three-dimensional
Yeah,
video,
Can you give some more analogies of as to how the energy is stored in the layering of the cell of the structured water in the cell? The jelly-like structure, the layering. How is the energy stored in the different layers? Is there? It's like an onion,
Um,
or what are we talking here?
yeah, I guess it takes energy to order things. So that's like a low entropy state, he calls it. So if you have an explosion in your kitchen, like everything flies everywhere and it's disordered, that's a high entropy state. You have to expend energy to put everything in its place and order things and categorize things. That takes energy. It's the same kind of thing. So the water molecules are oriented in a disordered way, almost like a crystal. Like if we can do
But
X-ray
that's when they're
crystal.
bad, right? You're saying the bad cells or dysfunctional cells, so to speak, are disorderly, right, in their structure, right? They're kind of free.
Correct. Yeah, it's like they've been in the
Yeah,
active state and they haven't been able to return to the
yeah.
stable, resting, ordered state.
See, that makes perfect sense with Dr. Weiping Yu's Yuan theory. I don't know if you got to see the video I sent you, but um,
Yeah, I did watch a bit of it. Yep.
so with that idea, there is no monocharged particles. I think that was another assumption that was made, kind of like cell membrane, right? It's kind of like, okay, we're going to just presume this. We don't really have any conclusive evidence. And I think that same thing happened when the looked at the different charges, positive and negative charge. Oh, therefore it must be a particle that carries positive and a particle that carries negative, and then neutron. We have uh, neutrons and everything else, and that are
Yeah.
monocharged particles. Whereas I think that would be a mistake of the Western mind that assumes everything must be separated. It's a left hemisphere brain mistake to kind of cut and separate and isolate things in a mechanistic way. Whereas Dr. Yu's theory kind of bypasses that and says, well, let's just rethink that here. Why can't we assume, or based on evidence, of course, that he's going to make it, he does make in his arguments, that every particle is both positive and negative, having a dipolar particle, which is exactly that image that you developed on illustration is exactly the way Dr. Yu's magnetic
Hmm.
particle model works. I mean, he talks
Hmm.
about that for electricity. It's an excitation of magnetic particles in an existing medium that the excitation creates that kind of same effect that you were demonstrating. That he calls it like a domino effect. That's literally what you're demonstrating in your illustration, really. He also describes that for light, that light is not a wave particle duality, but rather a wave motion within the existing medium of magnetic particles based on that excitation of uh, of the source creating that wave of light. And so
Yeah.
the same thing happens with when you look at that's how the cell would function. That fits very nicely with Gilbert Ling's model, right? And then Dr. Yu always says that, if you take two bar magnets, right, their tendency is to align in the opposite poles, right, to kind of create a neutral
Hmm.
state, right? Um,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
so a disorderly piece of tissue would be constructed of cells that are not in that neutralized state. They're going to have a kind of free floating charged behavior. You know, they're going to be attracting and going around, kind of like you could think of it like comets flying or meteor, you know, comets and meteorites flying and colliding into things around the solar system. That's what disorderly cells would be doing, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's also interesting, I think, from Ray Peat's point of view, because he was always very clearly like against looking at receptors as the be all end all for how like signals are communicated through the body. But it's always a really bit vague, like what he means, like what other mechanism in there is there? Because yeah, if you read a textbook and you're reading about like hormones, it'll say the hormone travels through your bloodstream. It'll get to some tissue, it'll attach to surface of a cell. On the surface of the cell, there's a receptor. And then there's this like it'll position itself in the receptor. The receptor will activate and then it'll signal this cascade of other sort of molecular mechanisms all the way down into the cell, and sometimes into the DNA, sometimes activating an enzyme, and that being like the only sort of thing being studied and explored. Whereas very early on, there was lots of clues that a lot of the hormones didn't act through those mechanisms. So like he speculates. I don't know that he found much research on it because there's not much done, but he speculated that well he I think he would say he saw a lot of evidence of it as well, but that, for example, the way estrogen and progesterone affect the cell water makes a big difference. So estrogens are known to sort of disrupt that orderly structure of the water, which isn't like it's clear that that's a important function. Like when the cell activates, the cell water does need to become disordered to do whatever the action is. But then when it recharges and goes back into the resting state, it has to become ordered. But too much of that clearly just causes imbalance, and so you have cell. The problem with cancer is that it's just cell overgrowth. They're just stuck in like a growth mode rather than being a correct type of cell, and that's so estrogen is like a steroid type molecule, right? Made from cholesterol, and it's got these functional groups in it that are more like water based, so it makes like the cell water more like free, loose water. Whereas progesterone, which is its sort of antagonist molecule, or sort of opposite function, it causes the water. It doesn't have that effect on the water, so the water can be more organized. And it's interesting because I was reading a paper by Geraldine Pryor, researcher in estrogen and progesterone, and she very clearly states their roles. She says estrogen is clearly a like growth and proliferation type of signaling molecule, whereas progesterone is a maturation and specialization type of effect. And you can fairly obviously see how like those are supposed to be in balance. You need, tissue to grow, but then you don't want it to grow too much. You want it to start, turning into whatever functional tissue it needs to be. And you can see how that can become unbalanced. And it's fascinating that like, modern research points so much to like estrogen being involved in cancer, but without this like aspect of seeing how it's affecting the water and only looking at these receptor and genetic mechanisms, they're not even looking for like these other processes that lots of researchers, like Pete included, were pointing to, like, hey, there's this whole other world going on that you guys aren't exploring, like because this is too much this like genetics explains everything type of idea that you get taught
Yeah.
when you go through university.
That would be too much structure, not enough energy in their presuppositions about how disease works, right?
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
um, that's really interesting. So, um, you're talking about estrogen and progesterone. Again, you think of it like yin yang. There's this balance between structure and energy going on there, and that dynamic that's necessary in the production of a child in the womb, right? This harmony, and to the
yeah,
effect that that harmony is well balanced, you get a very healthy child development. But if there's a lot of stress and malnutrition or other toxicity factors going on in the mother's prenatal environment, that can create an environment in which some of the structure is malformed and some of the energy potential is not realized, right, for the child as they develop later on.
Yeah, yeah. And progesterone is known to be very important for like brain development, which is one of the most like energy um, uh, highest energy use part of the body. And you know, there's I don't know how many mothers there are that are reported like very smart babies from having supplemented progesterone through their pregnancy.
Mm.
Um, it's just kind of obvious, but somehow with the current like paradigm of understanding how the body works, this is totally missed. It's always comes back to some kind of genetics bias, which
Yeah.
yeah,
Now
there's this idea that
Ray says that's because they're a bunch of eugenicists Nazis. I don't know if that's necessarily your conclusion.
yeah, no, he definitely does spend a bit of time talking about how there's that bias that yeah it's
Think there's
no,
is there any other competing hypothesis that you could conceive of as to why they're so fixated? I mean, I study mimetic theory. That's an easy, way to look at it, that they're all caught up mimetically desiring the different people that have come before them that have that they perceive to have higher status than them, and therefore they're stuck in this
right,
kind of cultic like imitation of these forebears before them. That's one kind of simple, non-morally indicting analysis of why they're stuck on genetics. Another one would be they're simply corrupt, and if you understand metabolic health, then that would like eliminate the need for like the entire almost the entire lineup of the best-selling profiteering products in the big pharma
uh-huh,
arsenal.
uh-huh.
Where do you
Maybe, yeah.
where do you see these things?
Perhaps I'm too much on one end of the spectrum, but I try to think of the best case scenario, and I think best case scenario is just that there's too much centralization, and you're never going to have the best ideas from
Yeah,
just one person. Like, if there's too much control, it just means you've got like very few ideas and
yeah,
very
but that's
limited,
that's related to the mimetic explanation, because it's like the tendency of mimetic phenomena is to develop a kind of like enclosure based on sacrificial violence, and that sense is you create this centralized power structure that has the presumptive monopoly right to initiate coercion against anything that goes against the kind of resonance of ideas that they're all sharing, right? So
right.
anything that kind of goes against it, it's not necessarily that they're, we're not talking, you don't even have to go into, oh, they're evil or they're, whatever, but rather it is the natural tendency of human beings when they're all kind of stuck in this mimetic kind of hive mind mindset, that this is the model of how we explore health and disease and so forth. And then someone comes along, there are funding mechanisms in universities, there are professorships, there are tenure issues, there are grants, there are a variety of different mechanisms in place to exclude ideas and people who would disrupt the entire paradigm by which people are operating in these fields. I mean, Thomas Kuhn talks about how paradigm shifts happen, and it happens when enough anomalies pile up that overthrow the existing
Yeah.
paradigm in a way that is almost like a political revolution, right? And that's because I think so much of what passes for scientific consensus is just that. It's politically, in the true sense of the word politics, a politically mediated decision of following other people who have higher social status than you, right?
hmm Yeah. Yeah, it's
So,
interesting. That's Renee Girard's
yeah,
um stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, I've only heard a little bit about that, but that's an interesting way to look at it.
yeah. I've synthesized some of the ideas of Thomas Kuhn in with Rene Girard to kind of understand the kind of retardation that takes place when government comes along and kind of monopolizes so much of science, right? It's because of its natural monopoly behavior patterns of initiating coercion. I mean, you can't make
Mhm.
claims about anything in the United States about something helping with another, illness or something without being coerced and threatened with criminal charges, right? So that's just the way it works in
Mhm.
the Western world, and that retards so much of our scientific understanding. And that's why politics can't solve it because these are things that have to be attitudinal changes. Somebody has to have the courage to do the right thing, and enough people have to get on board with it and work together as a team to bring these ideas and insights to the public, even if it means great social shame or personal retribution or suffering or exclusion. That's just the whole point, right? And that's kind of like the hermeneutic of suspicion that people have to have in imitation of Jesus. Rene Girard understood all of this because of his study of the gospel and the biblical text, to understand that basically in order to innovate, you have to take on the mind of Christ and his ability to do what is right, tell what is true, and live what is right and true, and call truth to power against, sacred cows of aura and social status, like the scientific institutions and government agencies that kind of work together, and be willing to go against that herd, even if it means suffering greatly, right? That's the courage that we have to have. And to imitate that is a tall order for a lot of folks. It's very tough.
Yeah. It's interesting because that goes along with Ray Peat's idea of like his sort of political energy went into nutrition. He made that comment a few times and it never made sense to me. I was like,
Yeah.
what are you talking about? Like, but I think he really saw that like if you get the population healthy enough, they can think independently, they can organize,
Yeah.
coherently, they can act, they can, build that what they want in their community, and then that scales. And it took me a while to see that, but I thought, oh, that makes sense. Like you can spread knowledge and information that really affects people. They think better, they organize better,
Yeah.
and then that's a way to. And it's interesting because it's fractal, like you see, like the body working like that. It's all big,
Yeah.
symphony, harmony. Like as long as it has energy, right?
Yeah.
And there's this
Yeah.
this whole thing
Yeah.
about like energy
Yeah.
creating structure.
So important. And that intuition, when we're children and we're healthy, we have this creative, intuitive wonder. Everything is so full of life, right? I mean, I remember that a tree in my backyard became a ship with all kinds of adventures that were engaged with and stories to be told. Everything was so full of life. I remember going to the checkout at the grocery store as a kid and seeing the National Enquirer report that Bigfoot was sighted, and then I heard a story that there was a Bigfoot sighted down the road and the highway, and that everything felt so alive. Magic and
Mm,
wonder and enchantment was around every corner, and that had a lot to do with having a very high vibrational thyroid, right? I mean, that
mm,
sense of wonder and possibility and delight to live is a
yeah,
part of love and being in a loving environment, and your thyroid is flourishing and it's just humming along vibrationally so high. And then as you continue, everything in this society is designed to destroy that, right? You go to schooling and they squeeze it out of you. I remember one time I was at a school and it was situated in an environment which was a very low income area, very low income, because it's like one of those, they have like charter schools and stuff, and they put them in these places that are low income. And I remember looking outside of the school. We were waiting for the teacher to let us into the classroom on the outside. And I was looking outside and we were surrounded by this big metal fence. And on the other side, I saw people who looked like they didn't have a job. They didn't have anything to do because in the middle of the day, the morning, afternoon, and they were just sitting there in their front yard with a with a with a bench press set, just doing benches. And I
mhm,
remember thinking, God, they're free, and I'm in prison here. I'm in prison. This is like a prison. You have to go to this
mm,
stupid thing and tuck your shirt in, or you lose points. They had a system like.
mm,
I was like, this is such a soul sucking environment, and they wake you up so you don't get proper sleep. You got to get to school at like, I don't know how it is in Australia if you guys get up
mm,
there, if it's easy, but I remember you had to like get up really early, and
mhm,
and then you're regimented the entire time, and you're it's just a horrific
Yeah,
situation. And you make the best out of it, right? And everybody said, well, you got to go through it. And it's like, that's that kind of, again, that learned helplessness slave mentality of saying, well, I went through that, so everybody needs to go through that too, you know?
yeah. It's like a whole nother way to order society. Just, top down, like this is how the way we all have to be. We have to um, be socially conditioned so we behave appropriately. We know who the authority is. We know who the person in the white coat is. We know when to shut up, depending on who's around. Like, yeah. Whereas like, if you meet people outside of that structure, you have to use a totally different like intuitive system for trying to feel like, is this a safe person? Can I
Right,
trust this
right,
person? Do I
right. And,
do I
that,
want
and
to?
the more you practice that, the more stronger you become in tune with, and that's what that is your magnetic sense, right? The sixth sense is the magnetic field sense, and it's your whole body. You know, that's why people say I have a gut feeling, or they feel a whole body presence when they walk into a room and there's a dark energy of feuding or
Mm,
liars or creeps or weirdos. If
yeah,
they're in touch with their magnetic field of their body, if their body is somewhat healthy, they're going to
yeah,
feel that without their
yeah.
brain
They say
really
they feel
registering
it
it.
in the air.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's your magnetic field, and everybody knows that, and they turn it into, people kind of relegate it to like woo woo stuff, but that's just because there's no adequate scientific
mm,
development of these ideas in a formal way, right? So then it just gets developed in a kind of folk way, right? So we talk about animal magnetism when it comes to people's relationships. We talk about, there's popular notions of, your thoughts create your reality and these different things. And these are all grasping, intuitive graspings in the dark, and they're fine, right? But they get relegated to woo because there's no formal scientific expression of them except for Dr. Yu's physics theory, and I'm talking about on the physics level. I'm sure there's others that are very close to it in different ways, but Dr. Yu's theory simplifies it so elegantly. It's astounding. It's beautiful because truth should be simple and intuitive, just like Ray Peat's ideas. It's infinitely complex if you want to pursue that layer, but it's something everybody can intuitively understand.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And with the um, is it Dr. Yu's model?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah, he simplified it all down to it's like magnetism.
yeah,
You can explain everything with magnetism,
yeah.
and he's
One
gotten rid of
particle.
the strong and weak force. It's
Yeah, you
funny
know.
because I was watching a lot of the Electric Universe crowd content. They've got
Yeah,
this Thunderbolts channel, and
yeah,
they've done a similar thing, but it's all like reduced to like the electric force is the
right.
primary thing, and you can show how everything comes out of that. And
Yeah,
to me, what that means is clearly like the standard model's too complex, and you see that in like the the history of science that like things often start out very, very complicated. Like one of the good examples is the epicycles Greeks or Romans came up with for understanding how the planets move. They had all these
yeah,
weird crystal
yeah,
shells that were laid on top of each other that explained how they all moved. And then it turned out that a much better predictive model was a much more simple model when
yeah,
Galileo and Newton and the rest of the guys came along and um, had a much better model or much more simple model, which interestingly is easier to like explain, I guess,
yeah,
which is strange because the universe could be you know uh, how complex it is could be totally arbitrary or unrelated to our capacity to understand it, but for whatever reason, um, making it more simple is somehow more accurate in lots of cases.
yeah. I don't think Electric Universe adequately or addresses the presuppositions of the standard model on the small level, on the atomic level. But
Right.
it does get some good ideas intuitively out there on the cosmological level, and planets and suns and everything. But again, yeah,
Yeah.
they're in the right direction. But Dr. Yu's model brings it all together because, again, it can explain things like oncology insights. It can explain things like, why does low temperature nuclear energy work, but nuclear fusion never produces more energy than what's put in? It can explain all of those things, a whole host of different things over the years that we've articulated and documented on our program. But, um,
Hmm.
ultimately, none of that, unfortunately, it does matter, but it won't matter quickly enough in our time unless there are dramatic innovations and inventions brought to the public using. See, this is the way it works. You have a better model. Let's say it's like a metaphor is, we're in Portugal or wherever, and we're getting these ideas that there's a new world, right? And I have a map that says there is a new world, and then you have a map that says there is no new world to sail to, right? At some
Mm-hmm.
point, the map, which is your model of physics, is either right or wrong, and somebody, which would be the engineers and inventors and so forth, have to take a boat and sail it with the map as a kind of guide to predict where they're going to land. Are they going to end up in India? Are they going to end up sailing off the edge of the earth, or they're going to end up in a new world like other maps predicted, right? And that's what's going on with physics. You have to use your, if it doesn't matter if it's simpler, because there's so much political inertia and monopoly privilege of these old ideas that they just kind of continue to float along unchallenged by the it's just artificially left, kept away from competition. And then what happens though that ultimately will disrupt that is that you sail to a new world using a map that their model says doesn't exist. That there is no new world, their old model of physics says. And we say, no, our map shows there is a new world and we can sail here and here to get there. And that ultimately will be the thing that changes history, is people having the courage to get in the boat and create a company and create anti-gravity or create energy too cheap to meter in various different forms and create breakthroughs and these various things
Yeah.
described that will be so irresistibly uh, uh, charismatic and so
Mm-hmm.
abundantly amazing that people are going to
Yeah.
say, we don't give a damn if this violates the old model. To hell with the old model. The old model says this isn't possible. We're going to go and shift our gears towards this. And that's how you change it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
totally agree.
yeah.
That's a lot of time when sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, a lot of time like in my research coming across all these sorts of alternative models, especially like for physics, like how the atomic world works or subatomic world. People have so many ideas, but I'm always frustrated because I'm like, okay, if you're so sure you're right, why don't you apply it? Pick something small, achievable that
Yeah.
apply it,
Yeah.
exploit whatever this new understanding is, and build on that. Whereas
Mm,
it's so common to see just lots of theory um, without much application. But
yeah.
surely, if like if your model does better understand things, like there should be so many ways like, to benefit from that. And I totally agree. That's the way to like prove it. Like when they came to the New World and came back with lots of silver and gold,
Yeah.
like that's all anyone needs to see. Oh, where'd you get that from?
Yeah.
Oh, that place that doesn't exist. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. That clearly we were wrong about
Yep.
that.
Yep. And
That's
that's how incarnational action is superior to Gnostic stuff. Because here's what I'm trying to get at. When you tell people you have a new theory, they say, well, okay, we'll publish it in peer reviewed journal. That's a Gnostic move. See
right.
what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a place of the mind. Oh, let me get high status paper journals to publish your work, and then that will socially validate. Okay, now you're dealing in lunchroom drama. Now you're dealing in the world of the mind. But incarnational action, when you lug in a bunch of gold from a place they didn't know existed, that's where you get change.
hmm Yeah.
What I want to ask you real quick, and we'll land the plane here, but briefly, I know
hmm
it's kind of a random place to go, but you were talking about estrogen's role in creating these, these hyper,
Growth,
yeah,
generally.
growth. I'm trying to use certain language to protect us from the Borg bots and so
Sure.
forth. But how does lactic acid and cortisol and some of these other things play a role in this? Because
Yeah.
lactic
So,
acid is often
lac
present, right, when you have these growths.
yeah. So lactic acid is produced from glucose instead of making ATP. If normally if you have say glucose enter a cell, ideally you want to make as much ATP as possible so that you can structure the water and all the other things that follow that. But if your mitochondria or respiratory like process is damaged, which can happen from toxins, or PUFA does it, or low thyroid does it, instead of making, for example, 36 ATP from the glucose, the glucose doesn't even enter the mitochondria, it just stays in the cytosol of the cell, and it produces lactic acid
What is
instead,
lactic acid for
and
analogical?
2 ATP. Um, so it does make some ATP, but it's far less than what would have been made in um, the mitochondria, and so in effect, it's actually wasting the glucose. And lactic acid is also like, you can it's in like dairy products generally, because the bacteria also convert the um, glucose or other sugars into lactic acid. And yeah, so it's but most people know about when like you've run too hard for your fitness level, and you feel ill, you get too much lactic acid buildup, and it's just generally not a metabolic stimulant. It's something that slows everything down, because the liver actually has to process the lactic acid once it's in your blood, and that actually uses up more energy than it got from the glucose to turn into the lactic acid. So it's just this horrible cycle to get stuck in.
Wow. Wow. So how can you reduce lactic acid buildup?
Yeah, so you want to make sure your mitochondria are working
Happy.
well, and the
That's why you got
simplest
to
way
go
to
to 8,000 feet like you did, huh? My goodness.
well, yeah, that should help. But for a lot of people, if you're not getting the right nutrition, you won't have the B vitamins, you won't have all the cofactors to make the mitochondria happy, because if you get down to the details, there's all these like enzymes that have to do their thing, shuttling electrons, and there's all these various cofactors that are dependent on B vitamins, or like CoQ10. Like there's all these factors that you need, or like the right minerals, calcium, magnesium balance. So good nutrition needs to be a base. And if people haven't explored just good nutrition, which from Ray Peat view, he's figured out a way to do that at a very low cost with his recommendations of
Yeah, he has
eggs,
very working
dairy,
class, yeah,
right?
working class
Yeah,
solutions.
widely available. So orange juice, for example, like really high in minerals, magnesium, which is very low in a lot of people's diets. So that's a good place to start.
You drink a lot of orange juice. Now, milk, does that have lactic acid in it? And why does he recommend milk?
So the fresher it is, the lower the lactic acid would be. But yeah, as it's going off, like you can taste it go sour, and that's lactic acid, and as well as a whole other bunch of stuff. And he doesn't recommend yogurt usually, because that's got even more lactic acid in it. So it's generally to be avoided. But I think the pros outweigh the cons with the minor amount of lactic acid in milk.
Does people's lactose intolerance, is that related to some kind of inability to deal with lactic acid or no?
Right. So I remember learning in university that that was a genetic cause, and they showed a map of the world, and these are the people that can't drink milk, and these are the people that can drink milk. But then Ray Peat points to these studies showing that if people, regardless of where they're from, drink it long enough, it doesn't really matter what genetics they have, suddenly they are able to digest the lactose. So if people persist with it,
So it has
and
nothing to do
they're
with
not,
lactic. It has nothing to do with the lactic acid problem, that issue.
um, I'm not sure what you mean.
I'm saying lactose intolerance. You said that the body has to go through this really difficult process of the liver has to deal with the lactic acid, right? And I was just wondering if you drink lactose milk and you're intolerant to it, is there something related to lactic acid there going on?
Right. Well, it would add. Well, the problem is if you shouldn't be in that state with your body anyway, of your body turning the glucose into lactic acid, and by eating some in your diet, that's going to add to that load. So yeah, that would cause a problem. But in a healthy person, the amount of the lactic acid in dairy products, for example, shouldn't be a problem.
Do you think it's safe if someone has a lot of PUFA fat stored on their body that they should, is it still safe for them to eat sugar in abundance like Ray Peat recommends?
I think so, because the liver can actually turn the sugar into the type of molecule that can attach to the PUFA and get it out of the body without actually burning it for fuel, and it like gumming up the mitochondrial enzymes.
Yeah. Again, going back to the magnetic structure thing, you can look at saturated fat as a neutralized magnetically neutral, stable structure, saturated fat,
Right.
whereas PUFA is a magnetically unstable, charged particle, right? And it's going to go
Yeah.
around and do all kinds of chaotic stuff to different tissue when
Yeah.
it's used.
Yeah.
Very
Yep.
simple
Exactly.
stuff when you look at things. Why wouldn't matter work on every level in the same holistic way, right? I mean, why does it have to be, oh, there's gravity? Why isn't gravity just a manifestation of magnetic attraction in the
Mm,
earth? You know, why do we have to
mm.
assume all these distinct, just so distinct forces? Oh, there's antimatter. No, it's just dipolar magnetic particles. Oh, there's infinite universes. No, you're just a sci-fi nerd. You know, I mean, all of this stuff is just,
Yeah, I think it's the
yeah,
left brain thing again.
yep, yep,
Identifying these isolated objects, so there must be another object.
yeah, yeah. I really
Yeah.
appreciate your time. It's been great talking to you, and maybe we can do it again sometime. How about that?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it too. Thanks for having me on.
And how can people follow you on X? Tell people anything else you'd like to share.
Yeah, so my handle is Bioenergetic Brain, and yeah, I'm always posting whatever I'm learning or thinking about, and yeah, be great to see people there.
What's the best thing you can do to have a bioenergetic brain?
Identify if you have low blood sugar and correct it ASAP,
All right, very good. Thank you for your
consistently.
yeah, very good. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks, David. Bye.